program is The Active Center. It's created by David Sappe.
Pronounced Seppi.
Let's talk about media bias, but, probably not in the way you're used to thinking about it. Forget all the stuff about secret backroom conspiracies. The real story, the one that affects us every day, is about this kind of invisible filter that shapes almost everything we see, read, and hear. And that brings us to the big question we're tackling in this explainer. Is the news you see really the whole story? Well, the short answer is nope, almost never. And we're about to break down exactly why that is.
Okay, so first things first, we've got to get on the same page here. What even is media bias, really? To get a handle on it, we need a solid definition to work with.
Now, here's the core idea, and it's super important. Media bias isn't usually about telling straight-up lies. It's actually way more subtle than that. It's the distortion of truth that happens through the framing of information, how the story is presented to help out a specific perspective or interest.
This brings up a really crucial distinction. It's easy to mix up media bias with media criticism, but they are totally different things. See, bias actually distorts a topic to make it fit a certain viewpoint. Criticism, on the other hand, just takes a look at how a topic is being handled, but without messing with the facts. It's a fine line for sure, but it is a very, very important one. All right, let's move on and see how this all works in the real world. I like to think of this next part as opening up the bias toolkit. We're going to zoom right in on the specific tools that get used, consciously or not, to shape a story.
The first tool in the box is probably one of the most common and honestly one of the most powerful: bias through selection and omission.
So how does this actually work? Well, the mechanism is pretty simple, right? It's literally impossible to report on every single fact or interview every single person for a story. Choices have to be made. The bias slips in with what gets chosen and what gets left out. Think about it. A story about a protest that only talks to the protesters but not the police or the local shop owners, that's omission in action. And the impact can be huge, leading to massive public misunderstanding because crucial context is just gone.
Next up in our toolkit is bias by placement and story selection. This one is all about what gets the spotlight and what gets shoved into the corner. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Think about what you see right at the top of a news website or leading the evening broadcast. It's treated as a major story. Its placement alone screams, "This is important," before you've even read a single word.
But what about the other side of the argument? Often it's still there somewhere, but it's buried deep inside the website, or it's a tiny little mention at the very end of the article. So yeah, it's technically there, but its placement is basically telling you, hey, this part isn't a big deal. It's a classic way to make one perspective seem way more important than another.
Okay, our third tool is incredibly subtle, but man, is it effective. This is bias through labeling. So how does labeling work its magic? Well, it's all about slapping a subjective label onto an entire group of people. For instance, instead of saying this group advocates for stricter environmental policies, a report might just call them eco-warriors or tree huggers. See what happens? It immediately categorizes people based on an assumption, not on their actual position. And the wildest part? A lot of the time this happens unconsciously. It just reflects the writer's own built-in worldview. And that brings us to the final tool in our kit, bias through spin. This one is less about what you leave out and way more about the particular take or interpretation you create.
Spin is all about interpretation. It's about creating a heavily skewed take on an event that might seem totally objective on the surface. For example, a politician's new tax plan could be spun as a bold investment in our future or as reckless government spending. Same set of facts, two completely different stories. And the goal here is rarely just to inform. It's usually to ignite some kind of strong public emotion, like anger or shame, to get you to react a certain way.
Okay, let's do a quick recap. Here's our complete bias toolkit laid out. You've got selection and omission to frame the whole narrative, placement to prioritize one view over another, labeling to categorize people based on assumptions, and spin to fire up emotions. Each tool works a little differently, but they're all aiming for the same thing, to shape your perception of the story.
So we spend all this time looking at how media gets produced. But you know what? That's only half the story. Let's talk about your role in the system. Because you're on the other side of that screen, and you play a pretty big part in all this too. The truth is, media bias doesn't just happen to us in a vacuum. We actually complete the circuit. It starts with something we all do, selective consumption. We naturally lean towards news sources that confirm what we already think.
Then you layer on algorithmic influence, which is even more powerful. All those platforms we use are constantly curating our feeds, creating a massive omission bias without us even noticing. The result? You and your neighbor could be getting completely different versions of reality delivered to your phones every day.
So, we've defined bias, we've gone through the toolkit, and we've even looked in the mirror a bit. Let's get to the most important part, the takeaway. What does all this actually mean for you?
The whole point of this was to hand you the toolkit. Now you can spot those invisible filters when they're at play, the selections, the placements, the labels, and the spin, which really just leaves one final, very important question. Now that you can see the filters, what are you going to do differently?